On a cold, rainy evening in New York, a homeless man sat alone outside a small café. Hundreds of people walked past him, but no one stopped. Until one young girl did something very simple. She bought him a cup of coffee, and unknowingly changed his life forever. It was a cold and rainy evening in New York City. The streets were shining with water from the rain, and people were rushing home to escape the cold wind. Cars passed quickly, umbrellas moved like waves in the crowd, and the bright lights of the city reflected on the wet pavement. Outside a small cafe on a quiet corner of the street, sat an old man. His clothes were worn and thin. His shoes were torn, and his hands were trembling from the freezing air. His name was George. But George was not always homeless. Many years ago, he had a normal life. He had a good job, a small house, and a loving wife. His life was simple but peaceful. Then life took a turn. His wife became seriously ill. The hospital bills kept growing, and George sold almost everything he had to pay for her treatment. Eventually, he even had to sell their house. But despite all his efforts, his wife passed away. After that, George lost his job as well. Without a home, without family, and without support, he slowly found himself living on the streets. Yet there was one thing about George that was different from many others. He never begged. Every day he simply sat outside the same cafe, watching people come and go. People walked past him every day. Businessmen with expensive coats, students laughing with friends, couples holding hands, but no one really saw him. To them, he was invisible. Just another homeless man sitting on the street. That evening, as George sat quietly with his head down, the door of the cafe opened. A young woman stepped outside. Her name was Emma. Emma was a university student. She worked part-time while studying so she could pay for her education. She was kind-hearted and always believed that small actions could make a big difference. As she reached the cafe door, her eyes suddenly noticed George sitting there. She stopped. For a moment, she simply looked at him. His hands were shaking from the cold. He looked tired and alone. Emma walked inside the cafe. 5 minutes later, she came back out. In her hands was a hot cup of coffee and a sandwich. She slowly walked toward George and gently said, "Sir, I thought you might need this." George looked up in surprise. For a moment, he couldn't even speak. No one had spoken to him like that in months. His eyes filled with tears. He slowly replied, "You should keep it. You probably need it more than I do." Emma smiled softly. "I'll be okay, but you look like you need it more right now." George carefully took the cup. The warmth from the coffee slowly spread through his cold hands. He looked at Emma again and said quietly, "You have no idea what you just did for me." Emma laughed gently. "It's just coffee." George shook his head slowly. "No, it's more than that." He paused for a moment. "You reminded me that there are still good people in the world." Emma sat with him for a few minutes and talked with him. Then she had to leave. Before walking away, she said something simple. "I'll see you tomorrow." George watched her walk away into the crowd. For the first time in many months, he felt something he had almost forgotten. Hope. The next day, Emma came back. And the day after that. And the day after that. Sometimes she brought coffee. Sometimes soup. Sometimes just a smile and a short conversation. Slowly, George began talking more. He told her about his past, about his wife, about his job, about how everything slowly disappeared from his life. Emma listened carefully. One day she asked him a question. "George, if you had the chance, would you work again?" George gave a small laugh. "Who would hire an old man like me?" Emma replied, "You never know unless you try." A week later, Emma did something unexpected. She took George to a small grocery store nearby. Her friend worked there. The owner of the store looked at George for a moment. At first, he hesitated. But then he said, "If you're willing to work hard, I can give you a chance." George could hardly believe what he was hearing. After years of feeling invisible, someone was finally giving him an opportunity. A few months later, everything had changed. George was no longer sitting outside the cafe. He now had a small rented room. He had clean clothes, and he had a job. But more importantly, he had dignity again. One evening, George invited Emma to the same cafe where they first met. When Emma arrived, she was surprised. George looked different. He looked healthy, confident, happy. He handed Emma a small envelope. Inside was a note. Emma read it slowly. It said, "One cup of coffee changed my life. From today, every month I will buy meals for 10 people who are struggling, just like I once was." Emma's eyes filled with tears. George smiled and said, "You showed me kindness when I had nothing. Now it's my turn to pass that kindness forward." That day, Emma realized something important. Sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change someone's entire life. And somewhere in this world right now, there may still be someone like George, sitting quietly, waiting for someone like Emma.